Mhm.
Okay, so welcome everyone to this guest lecture by Professor Stephan Lewandowsky. The topic will be the language of democratic backsliding. A computational analysis of US Congressional speeches reveals a shift from evidence to intuition. And Professor Lewandowsky is a cognitive scientist at the University of Bristol in the UK. His main research interests are how people respond to misinformation and propaganda, why people reject well-established scientific facts, for example, related to climate change and the effectiveness of vaccinations, and how this affects democracy. And he has also been working with policymakers at the European level for many years. So.
Okay, thank you, Linda. Thanks for coming. Now, I'm assuming people can hear me online as well. If not, then maybe, I don't know, type something in the Q&A or whatever so we can fix the problem. Okay, well, what I want to talk about today is democratic backsliding. And I'm going to report work that was done by a team of people from lots of different places. As you can see there, the primary people driving the analyses is Shigun and David Garcia from the University of Konstanz in Germany. So my departure point for everything I want to talk about today is that democracy is in retreat around the world, unfortunately. Now, we know this from a number of different analyses, all of which converge on the same conclusion. This graph here is from a report by the VDIM Institute in Sweden. And the way to read this graph is to realize that any point that is below the diagonal represents a country that has experienced a decline in democracy across the 10 years between 2011 and 2021. And you can see quite a few EU member states that are below that diagonal. And you can also see the United States as being below the diagonal. And it's an open question as to what's going to happen in 2 weeks and how this will unfold from there. So that's one way of considering it. Here's an even quicker way of grasping what is going on worldwide. This is the number of countries that are democratizing on top and those that are autocratizing at the bottom. And you can see that 20 years ago, there were a lot of countries becoming more and more democratic. That number has shrunk. Whereas by contrast, there was only a small number of countries 20 years ago that was heading towards autocracy. But that number has now almost quadrupled in the last 20 years. So that to me is reason for concern. And an obvious question to ask is why? Why is this happening? Now, that question doesn't have a simple answer. Obviously not. But if you look around and see what the experts are saying, then one issue that is mentioned invariably almost is the prevalence of misinformation, disinformation, and propaganda as being implicated in this democratic backsliding. Just to illustrate that, what I'm showing you here is a risk analysis published by the World Economic Forum earlier this year, and this is based on expert judgments. Hundreds of experts around the world were asked to identify the greatest risks facing the world over the next 2 years and the next 10 years. And as you can see, at least in the immediate future for the first 2 years, misinformation and disinformation were identified by those experts as the greatest risk we're facing ahead of climate change and polarization and inflation and all sorts of other things. So let's focus on misinformation. I've been doing that for the last 20 years, so where else would I focus? That's what I study. And what I'm particularly interested in is this conundrum. We have had an American president who, according to fact checkers, made more than 30,000 false or misleading claims during his presidency. That's roughly 1 an hour, 24/7. If you do the numbers, it's close up to that. And at the same time, among his voters, 3/4 of Republicans consider Donald Trump to be honest. And that, to me, is the bigger problem. The fact that there is a lot of misinformation out there is a problem. But the fact that people who are spreading that misinformation are then considered to be honest, that to me is an even bigger problem. And so there are two things I want to address today. What is honesty or truth? If Donald Trump is honest, then what does honesty mean to different people? And if we can understand that, then the second question is, how do honesty and truth relate to the functioning of democracy? And my claim is that I have at least partial answers to both of those issues that I want to share with you today. So, first question. What is honesty or truth? Well, turns out, if you look at the literature in philosophy and history and political science, it is very interesting because there is a fairly consistent dichotomy that people talk about. That there's, on the one hand, something about evidence. When you want to be honest, you also got to be accurate. You want to tell the truth, there has to be evidence in support of that, on the one hand. But on the other hand, the discussion about honesty and truth invariably also involves something about feelings, intuition, and above all, sincerity. The fact that I'm expressing my feelings honestly, well, that is an aspect of honesty. And for that to happen, I don't have to be accurate. I just have to be honest in what I say to you, how I feel. Now, one aspect of this is that if you focus a little more on the 1920s and the 1930s, then you discover that so-called intellectuals of fascism zero in on this intuitive aspect of truth and honesty and basically said, well, the only thing that is really truthful is this authentic feeling that the Fuhrer is translating for you. And, that feeling is the only organic truth out there. They explicitly rejected the idea that evidence was anything that could adjudicate anything. Basically, they said, well, it is this organic, mythic experience of the soul. That, I think, is kind of important to keep in mind. We've been here once before, and we need to keep that in mind. So, based on this, to make a long story short, based on this historical analysis, and a couple of papers later, my team and I came up with this summary of the space that is mapped out by honesty, truth, and these different components. And so what we decided to do is to represent it in the schematic diagram where we have honesty referring to a person on the left, and we have truth referring to the world on the right. And within each, we differentiate whether honesty and truth are arrived at by looking inward or by looking outward at the world. So let me start by focusing on honesty. So this now is the perception of a person? What do you think is honest? And it is also the speech acts by a person that are tacitly representing a notion of honesty that either relies on evidence or intuition. Now, we call the outward-facing reliance on evidence, we call that fact-speaking. And there's a sample here of text that, in ways I'll explain later, we identified as fact-speaking at the top, which we say represents an attempt to make contact with the world through evidence. And at the bottom, we have what we call belief speaking, which is that other component of honesty that relies on intuition and sincerity. And sadly, the projector isn't really showing the text too much up here. The color scheme isn't all that great, but you'll see more examples later to illustrate this distinction. So what I want to do now is I want to focus on this distinction, these two subjective conceptions of honesty, and I have linked these two different approaches to politics, in particular populism on the one hand, and then liberal democracy on the other. And that is because it is an intrinsic aspect of populism to talk about, the common sense of the people that trumps the so-called evidence by elites, such as scientists or experts. So belief speaking is key to this populist conception of honesty. Fact speaking, on the other hand, is key to an idealized liberal democracy that relies on evidence, or at least we assume it should. Evidence-based policy making is a sort of mantra of Western democracies. So those are the two conceptions of honesty I'm going to be working with. And I'll say a bit more about these as I go along, because I got to clarify a lot of things about these concepts and what I mean by that. So first of all, I should tell you that belief speaking and fact speaking are sort of endpoints of a continuum. I can be entirely reliant on my gut feeling, or I can be entirely reliant on evidence. Those would be the extreme endpoints of a continuum. However, at the same time, these components of honesty coexist. Most theoreticians of honesty would argue that there's a component that consists of belief speaking. There's another component that consists of fact speaking. So they do also coexist and overlap. And in fact, just to be clear, even in a democracy, healthy discourse involves some form of belief speaking. There are some issues that are not adjudicated by evidence. For example, I would argue abortion. How do you adjudicate whether banning abortion or legalizing it is a good idea based on evidence alone? And there are many other issues where beliefs legitimately come into play. But I would also argue that if all you have is belief speaking, then you have a problem. Because the moment it is only a matter of belief, well, then you can no longer have a civilized discussion. There's evidence-based. There's no accountability. It is all a contestation between different beliefs, which really means it's a contest of who can shout the loudest. And here are some sort of anecdotal utterances of various individuals who have opined on this in public. And when you hear things like, oh, truth isn't truth anymore by Rudy Giuliani, then, you're kind of thinking, well, what's going on here? Anybody can say whatever they want, and it's just my truth and not your truth. And then you walk away in this epistemic chaos where there is no resolution possible. So that, I think, is a problem. All right, that's background, theoretical conceptual background. So now, how can we identify these two components? I just sort of pulled them out of the hat. Well, wasn't out of a hat, was out of historical analysis. But still, knowing this is only half the story. We now have to identify these two different components of honesty. And how do we do that? Well, for our purposes, what we did was to generate dictionaries that we thought would capture rhetoric that tacitly involved one aspect of honesty or the other. Let me give you an example. Here are the first few. We have 50 of each to begin with, of the kind of words you would use when you're engaging in rhetoric that relies on fact speaking on the left, belief speaking on the right. If you talk about, evaluating, examining, analyzing things, well, presumably you're talking about evidence, and you have some outward-facing notion of what it means to be honest. If, on the other hand, you talk about feeling, claiming, confiding, etc., then probably you're talking about belief speaking. So, how do we know that these actually work or that they're correct? Well, we had human raters initially provide validation, explain to them what we meant by belief speaking and fact speaking. People can actually do this. There's great agreement, and they confirmed our choices. And we then took a geeky but important step by converting these dictionaries to so-called embeddings. What are embeddings? Well, if you know what embeddings are, I don't have to tell you. If you don't know what embeddings are, let me walk you through it at a sort of casual level of pseudo geeky talk. Well, you start out by creating vector representations. A vector is just a long string of numbers for words in their context. How do you do that? Well, you get a machine to crawl the web, and the top number there is 840 billion tokens of text that were scraped off the internet by this crawler. Now, we didn't do this. This has been done. It's available online. You then create a word co-occurrence matrix. In other words, you look at these 840 billion samples of text, you figure out what words follow each other. To illustrate this, this is a co-occurrence matrix for the sentences: the cat sat, and the cat with the hat. Dr. Seuss, famous children's book in Anglophone countries. And you just count the number of times that each word follows another one. So the was followed by cat 3 times and nothing else. Cat was followed by sat twice and with once, etc. You get the idea. So imagine having a matrix that is 2.2 million by 2.2 million, each word with every other word, and you get something that is so big, it'll probably be crazy and there's nothing you can do with it. So what you do instead is to apply some mathematical magic. You condense all the information about co-occurrence into a simplified matrix that still has 2.2 million rows, one for each possible word or token, type rather, not token, type in the corpus. And each row has 300 numbers that somehow represent the meaning of that word as inferred by its co-occurrence in context. So, once you've got that, you can do funky stuff. Because you can now take words and subtract them from each other. You can take the word Berlin and subtract Germany. What do you get? Well, some random pattern of 300 numbers. Why would that be of interest? Well, it would be of interest because you can also subtract Finland from Helsinki. And you get another random looking kind of cat. But you know what? Those two are going to be very similar. because they represent the meaning of the capital of a country based on this incredibly large corpus and the co-occurrence. And then if you really want, you can do even more math, and you can express Helsinki as the product, as the result of that arithmetic. So we now have something that has meaning embedded in these vectors, and we can take all our dictionary words, embed them into those vectors each, then average those embeddings, and then we have a single vector that is the belief speakingness of our belief speaking dictionary and the fact speakingness captured by our fact speaking dictionary. And we can do the same thing with text, any text, tweets, speeches, words, anything. And once we've done that, wow, we can compute the similarity. What does the similarity tell us? It tells us the extent to which any given body of text has embedded within it a tacit understanding of honesty consisting either of belief speaking or fact speaking. How do we know this works? Well, we validated it using the New York Times, applying our two dictionaries to different sections of the New York Times, nearly 1 million articles. And we find that opinion pieces are the highest expression of belief speaking, and articles in the science section are the highest expression of fact speaking, which is precisely what you would imagine. You can ignore the dimensionality of the numbers. Also, don't compare the columns, just go within each column. That's apples and oranges, can't compare them across. And that tells us that we're capturing something in the expected manner. So, having done that, we now looked at the real world, sort of, in this case, the American Congress. We looked at all the tweets ever tweeted by members of Congress between 2016 and 2022. That's about 1.6 million tweets. And we identify fact speaking and belief speaking using our dictionaries, as just explained, to capture the extent of fact speaking and belief speaking in each tweet. And we also capture it in news articles that were being shared by Congress people in those tweets. And just to give you an example, this is what? Fact speaking or belief speaking? It's an actual tweet by an actual congressman. Schiff is congressperson of the Democratic Party from New York, I think. This is somebody saying something about him. Well, that's not fact speaking. That's belief speaking. And this one, I work to ensure there's a fair trial. This is about Trump's impeachment. Make a determination about the severe. That's fact speaking. There are two examples that our dictionaries identify as belief speaking and fact speaking. And what's important here is that in neither case are any of the words in our dictionaries necessarily present, nor are the people who tweet this necessarily intending to be belief speaking or fact speaking. They're just using language that expresses how they view honesty. And that's an important thing to point out before I proceed. That up until now, we have simply identified two different types of rhetoric. Do people refer to belief or facts when they try to convey an honest opinion? Now, there's another dimension here, and that is the truth value of the information being communicated. We don't know anything about that yet, although we hypothesize that belief speaking is possibly more likely to be affiliated with misinformation, whereas fact speaking we assume to be linked more tightly to accurate information. For obvious reasons, I think, based on my introduction invoking populism liberal democracy. But we don't know that yet. We have to do the analysis. And here are the results of that analysis. Let me walk you through it. These are the congressional tweets. Each dot is a tweet. So, there's 1.6 million of them. On the left, we have belief speaking. On the right, we have fact speaking. On the y-axis in each panel, we are representing the likely accuracy of content based on the NewsGuard score of the website being linked to in the tweets. NewsGuard is a private corporation that's publishing indices of quality of different domains based on journalistic criteria and based on the judgment of professionals they employ to do this. And they look at things like, how often does this domain issue corrections? Do they differentiate between advertising and opinion and news reporting, et cetera, et cetera? Journalism 101 applied to thousands of domains. What do the data tell us? Well, first of all, looking at fact speaking. The more fact speaking a tweet expresses, top panel, the higher the NewsGuard score, the greater the accuracy. That's true for both parties. Although overall, blue for Democrats, they're ahead of red for Republicans, as is well known, because most misinformation in the United States is consumed, shared, and produced by Republican sources or sources near them, whichever way you look at it. But if even Republicans express fact speaking, then that difference to Democrats almost disappears. That's true for the tweets on top. It is also true for the content of the news articles they're sharing. Fact speaking is linked to accuracy. Now look at the left, belief speaking. Same thing, tweets on top, the shared articles at the bottom. What do you find? Well, you find a huge interaction with party. For Democrats, it doesn't matter terribly much. There's a subtle decline of accuracy of a domain the more they express belief speaking. But for Republicans, that is vastly accentuated. The more Republicans engage in belief speaking, the more likely they are to share a low quality source. And this is particularly true if you analyze the content of the articles being shared. So, conclusion one, belief speaking is a gateway to the sharing of misinformation. But it's only or mainly Republicans that avail themselves of that opportunity. All right, so much for honesty. We're talking about what we think of the person when they talk about honesty. When they talk, are they being honest? We're now shifting gears ever so slightly by talking about truth. Now, the difference between honesty and truth is that honesty is about a person, truth is about the world, but you can make a very similar distinction even for truth. I can arrive at the truth based on my gut feeling, we call that intuition-based, or I can arrive at it on the basis of analyzing the evidence. So we have that similar dichotomy on truth, and we can now ask, how does truth relate to democracy? Now, we did a very similar analysis, but now looking at truth rather than honesty, and looking at the rhetoric in the United States Congress by looking at congressional speeches. And again, we have dictionaries, which we arrived at in the same way as before. Candidate items, validation through human raters, up and down the yin-yang, back and forth, blah, blah, blah. They work. We're happy. We haven't validated. Now we know, or we can illustrate what we mean by intuition-based versus evidence-based speech by looking at samples from material in the congressional record. Now, look at the top. It's very complicated. It is not true that the only basis of valuation that can be blah, 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 investment account, actual ascertain. Oh. I mean, if that was an evidence-based, I don't know what is, right? I mean, that is kind of making my head hurt. So triple negatives and things I don't understand, but that's evidence-based. Now look at the bottom. Oh, yes, your howl about the farmers of the country and destruction is nothing but the wail of the old Sam pattern. This, by the way, is from the 19th century. So this distinction between intuition-based and evidence-based speech is not new. It has been with us for quite a long time. So what are we doing? We are looking at all speeches in the United States. Congress, I promised you in the 19th century, here it is, 1879 through 2022. That's about 8 million speeches. There's a lot of chatting going on in the Congress. We apply our dictionaries in the usual way, as I've explained, through embeddings and similarities, et cetera, to estimate the intuition-based versus evidence-based content of those speeches. And we then relate that to 3 indices of democratic welfare. There's lots of indicators of democratic welfare. This is not, we don't have a monopoly on choosing exactly the right indicator, but I think these are very reasonable. The first one is legislative productivity. How good is Congress? How well does Congress function? Turns out that political scientists have been struggling with this for decades, trying to identify, a good Congress, a bad Congress. And there are 3 ways in which they do that. There's the number of laws, there's some productivity index, and then there's an index of major legislation, big stuff that makes a difference. And they effectively just identify those and count them. So that's one indicator. And the assumption is that the more Congress pumps out stuff, the better they're working. Polarization in Congress, that's another indicator of democratic welfare. There's something here known as the DW nominate estimators, which is relying on an analysis of co-voting patterns in Congress over time, and you identify polarization when members of the 2 parties no longer vote with each other. Right? In a nutshell, that's how that works. And finally, we look at inequality in society, not in Congress, but in society, wealth inequality. That's obtainable from this database there. We have this record going back to, well, it depends, going back long enough for our analysis. And inequality, in turn, is known to be a predictor of a lot of societal ills. If inequality goes up, if it's sky high, then all sorts of other things are also bad in that society. If inequality is lower, as in Finland, then all the other indicators are also indicating a more, less fractionated, less violent, less unhappy society. Finns are the happiest people in the world. I don't know if you knew this, you should know, you're Finnish, but anyway, the data suggests you are. No comment on that. So that's what we're doing. So the first thing is to indicate truth in Congress. This is our results from that analysis, separating out evidence in green from intuition-based approach to truth in red. Again, this is rhetoric. There's no proof value to any of these points. But it is nonetheless very interesting to see the patterns that are apparent here, which is that since the 1970s, evidence has been going down and intuition has been going up, whereas previously it was all kind of intermingled. Now, to simplify this, we formed a different score between evidence and intuition. We call that the EMI score, evidence minus intuition. And that has the advantage of just giving us a single line that's easy to see and interpret. That shows the balance between evidence and intuition in Congress. anything above 0 means that the reliance on evidence exceeds that on intuition. Conversely, any negative number means intuition exceeds evidence. And you see exactly the same pattern from somewhere in the 1970s onward. From here on down, intuition exceeds evidence very rapidly. And we have this very dramatic decline, which turns out is bipartisan. Bottom graph, Democrats, Republicans shows it's bipartisan, with a possible exception in the last few years, where the Republicans' race towards intuition is much quicker. Then down to the Democrats, but again, that's just a few sessions of Congress, so maybe it's not totally significant. So that already tells us something about political rhetoric in the United States. But now, what about these indicators? Oh, before I get to the indicators, just to illustrate the strength of this, if you take the cusp, the most evidence-based phase in politics ever in the United States in 1975, then from then on, that decline from evidence to intuition is very powerful, linear, and with hardly any, variance, for this is a very strong relationship in social science data. So what about the other indicators? Starting with productivity, congressional productivity. These are the 3 indicators of productivity that I mentioned: number of public laws, also the bars. Then we have the MLI, major legislation, and LPI, which is the laws of, number of laws being passed. You can see that they're proceeding roughly in sync. And you can also see that the coverage is not identical. Unfortunately, some of the indicators don't go past 2006 or something. That's because the paper reporting them was published in 2008. So we have a little bit of sparsity here, but nonetheless, we do have the public laws, the raw count, as an indicator throughout the present. If we now correlate those 3 with the EMI score for the same time, I'm now showing you bivariate correlations rather than the time axis, because it is easier to show in 3 different plots. What you see is that there is a correlation in all 3 cases. This one doesn't look impressive, but if I remember correctly, it's nonetheless significant. But even if it's not, the other 2 are very good, very tight, and hard to overlook. What does that mean? That means that the more Congress focuses on evidence rather than intuition in political speech, the more productive it is. And conversely, the more it focuses on intuition, gut feeling, the less productive Congress is. So we can say that there's an association between evidence-based language and political productivity and the functioning of one part of government in the United States. Okay, what about polarization? Now, polarization has a long and interesting history. What we show here is simply polarization in Congress. The black lines, I should do it up here, although I find that screen easier to read. Polarization was high in the Gilded Age, which is the late part of the 19th century and early part of the 20th century. It then declines, this is World War I, declines, becomes extremely low during World War II, but then stays low for a surprisingly long time. And polarization has only been increasing dramatically since about Ronald Reagan, and then it goes on from there. And now we're incredibly polarized again in Congress. It's not unique. It's happened before 100 years ago, but it is still now at a much higher level, higher than it was observed 100 years ago. And it is unclear how much higher it could go. The public is shown in blue. We don't have data predating 1960. It's surprising when you do this sort of historical analysis, how much data is not available prior to, 1970, 1960, the dark ages, only 50 years ago, when data were not really available. But yes, public polarization follows suit. So whatever our analysis says about congressional polarization is also indirectly applying to the public. And the reason this is important, just to convince you that we're looking at a meaningful indicator here, is because elite polarization has all these known flow-on consequences. Because what it does is to decrease satisfaction with democracy. There's a strong association between elite polarization and how much people are satisfied with the function of democracy. And that, of course, is a concern if you're trying to protect democracy. So, how does that relate to congressional truth? Well, here it is. These are, again, data. Well, I'm showing the time here by labeling each dot with a year. But the basic idea is, again, that the more people talk about evidence, so these are positive EMI scores, the lower the polarization in Congress. Conversely, the more they rely on intuition, the greater the polarization. And if you look at the top left quadrant, that's the one with high intuition, high polarization. You can see that that's all the most recent in the US Congress. So you have a clear association between reliance on intuition and polarization. And finally, inequality. Well, this is what we know about inequality. This is putting in all the data that you can possibly get your hands on. The first 20 years of which are incredibly unreliable, so we decided to chop them, and we start around 1940. The reason we don't know anything prior to that, incidentally, is because there was no income tax in the US, and there was no way for anybody to know what anybody was making. This is all a surprisingly modern invention to file a tax return, pay tax to the federal government. Does not go back that far. It was Roosevelt in World War II that instituted all these things we now take for granted. And the expression of inequality that we use here is the share of income by the top 1%. So the richest 1%, how much of everything that's there do they gobble up? And this is the relationship between the EMI score, so truth versus evidence versus intuition, and income inequality. What's interesting here is that it's lagged by one session, meaning that what matters to income inequality is not what is happening now in Congress, but what happened about 3 years earlier. Makes a lot of sense, because Congress can actually do something about inequality through tax laws and welfare and other things. Well, this takes time for that to have an effect. So hence you have to go back in time and the previous Congress, so about 3 years ago. And that is what matters to inequality. And again, we have this very striking relationship that tells us that the more Congress considers evidence in its deliberations, the less inequality there is in society 3 years later. And the temporal path of this is also very clear, with the most recent years being way up here, top left, high inequality and high reliance on intuition. This relationship persists when controlling for polarization, so it's not that the two things are expressing the same thing. You can parcel out polarization and you still get an effect, an association between inequality and the evidence minus intuition score. from one Congress earlier. So, let me wrap up. What does this tell us about congressional speech and democracy? Well, the first thing is that words matter. What politicians say, either in Congress or on Twitter, actually makes a difference. It's not just random babble. You know, sometimes people are very casual about what politicians say, but actually, I think words matter. And in particular, it matters whether the language of Congress is more appealing to evidence than intuition, because if it appeals more to evidence, we've seen that productivity is greater, polarization is reduced, and societal inequality declines. So there is something seemingly desirable about politicians relying on evidence. Doesn't surprise me, but there may be other people who find that surprising. And unfortunately, in light of those results, there's been a noticeable decline in evidence-based language since the 1970s for both parties, but arguably quite a bit more over the last few years for Republicans. And this matters also because the closely related conceptions of honesty are, as we've shown, a potential gateway to misinformation. So again, the more people express beliefs rather than things relying on facts, the more likely they are to share misinformation. And just one last little glimpse into the past, into history, but also the future for us, because that's our next paper. We looked at Germany over the last 140, 160 years as well. This is the EMI score over time, popping up and down a lot until the 1930s. Uh-oh, fascism happens, and guess what? The bottom falls out, and it is all intuition, no evidence. Rebound after World War II, and then a fairly steady reliance, you know, sort of somewhere in the middle between evidence and intuition. But if you look at the decline in the United States, you compare it to this, then you can draw your own conclusions. And with that, thank you for your attention, and I'm happy to take questions.
Thank you very much, Steve. We can now take questions both from the audience and from people on
We
Zoom.
may have to go to
There's a
Zoom.
question.
Dan. Hi, Dan. Sorry, I need to. Yeah, Dan, I think you're allowed to talk now. Oh, I'm not the host. No, I am the host. There we go. Dan, I think you can talk now.
Okay, can you hear me okay?
Yes, I can. Thank you.
Oh, great. Thanks for a great talk, Steve. Nice to see you. I had a question about the first part of the talk on belief speaking versus fact speaking. What do you make of examples where politicians appear to be speaking their beliefs, but they couch it in the language of fact speaking? And presumably it wouldn't be picked up in your with your dictionary. So like the example I have in mind is Trump apparently claimed recently that under Biden, 107% of new jobs went to illegal aliens. So that statement is mathematically implausible on its face. And presumably when supporters hear that, maybe some of them think it's literally 107%, but probably they understand it more as the speaking of the belief that immigrants are taking jobs, and it's a lot of jobs.
Sure.
What do you make of examples like that?
Yeah, it's an excellent question. I get this every time, and it's a very good question. It is entirely possible to use fact-speaking language to mislead people. Okay, you can do that very easily by quoting fake statistics, talking about 107% of something, list goes on. Our analysis would not pick that up. Mm-hmm. However, in the the grand scheme of things, if you look at our data, there is, at the moment at least, in the United States Congress, that association between misinforming people and using belief-speaking terms. That doesn't mean that there aren't some clever people out there being equally misleading, but using fact-speaking language. So I totally agree, that's a possibility. Now, we have other work in progress that is beginning to pin this down, and that's a whole separate talk. But just briefly, what we find is that in addition to identifying different types of rhetoric, you also have to look at a more fundamental aspect of language, and that is its complexity. And it's hard to explain a whole research program in 30 seconds, but basically, language that is consistently complex, in other words, that uses adult syntax and structure throughout, tends to be of higher quality than language that is using a far less sophisticated vocabulary that is peppered then with the occasional word that gives the appearance of sophistication. In other words, if I use baby talk, but then I throw in the word like hypercomplexity or orbital parameters, no one knows what that means. But if I throw that in, then likely I'm fooling you. So, and that is another dimension that if you add that to the analysis I've just presented, then you come much closer and do an even better job of predicting whether something is accurate or not.
Thanks so much.
No, that's just, but that's another talk that I'll be giving in 6 months.
Great.
For fascinating talk. I was wondering about other contexts than society or parliament speeches and the Congress. Is this phenomenon, if like belief talk is associated with negative consequences, is it observable also across different contexts? Because it's like natural to think that in some contexts, like philosophical or moral discussion, it's more about like opinions and argumentations that would be more belief-based,
Yes,
but not necessarily in a negative way.
indeed. This is a cousin of the previous question. Are there other contexts where belief speaking isn't a problem? Yes, and this is again where the complexity provides a key. If you go to a philosophical discussion, in fact, what triggered our concern with this is that if you look at some of the most beautiful rhetoric in history, like Martin Luther King's letter from a Birmingham jail, for example, then it turns out that picks up a lot of the the markers of misinformation today. And we thought, well, hang on, that can't be right. Something is wrong here. And then it turns out that you need that other dimension, which is sophistication and complexity. And the moment you enter that, bang, Martin Luther King is nowhere near, Breitbart or whatever today. So, and I think the same would be true for those other contexts in which belief speaking does not have negative connotations. And let me underscore and reiterate what I said before. There's nothing wrong with belief speaking. It's part of democratic contestation, of debate. The problem is if that's all you have and you're not saying or acknowledging that evidence is relevant. That is when the problem arises, because that then is, well, how do you hold somebody accountable if truth isn't truth and evidence doesn't matter? Your truth is the same as my truth. All that means is whoever shouts the loudest carries the day. Any other questions, either online? No one? If you raise your hand online, I can give you the virtual microphone.
I have a question about whether you have similar data but for different kinds of contexts, like in Europe or in parliaments where you have more than two parties. Like I'm thinking of the French one because that's where I'm from, where we have 5 to 6 parties. And more than one of them would be, I think, classified as a populist one.
Yes.
So I was wondering if you have any
Yes,
data on
yes.
those.
Yes, I do. Indirectly. I mean, first of all, if this now turns out to be, hang on, requires a little bit of juggling. Here we go. With the exception of Nazism, Germany has had a multi-party system, both before and after Nazism. And you can see that the analysis sort of works, quote unquote, in a similar manner. And by the way, if you look at the temporal pattern here, you can see that, as in the United States, the 1970s were the peak evidence-based language. So there's something about our Western culture, I think, that is in sync. We have also looked at Italy and the period of fascism, and we're in the middle of doing that. And so I can't tell you anything about it yet, but we're going to do that. We haven't done France because none of us speak French. I apologize. But other people, our French colleagues, have looked at that at Sciences Po. They have a big linguistic lab there. And what they find is that what matters to French political rhetoric, again, are two dimensions. There's one that is the conventional left-right. And then there's another one that is orthogonal and arguably more important, and that is whether the parties in question are pro or anti-establishment or status quo. Okay? And then all of a sudden you have parties over from the left and the right that both, you know, this is where you get this crossover between the right and the left that makes my head explode, where you can no longer tell whether somebody's right wing or left wing. Right? In the UK, the hard right and the hard left, I mean, you look at the stuff they say, you know, they're both anti-vaxxers and they're both anti-science and yeah, I mean, there's stuff that makes you wonder what is going on. And that second dimension is very important for France. But we haven't looked.
Any other questions?
Oh, I can't see online now. No one has, no.
Here.
Stephen, I'd like to follow up on that point about the far right and the far left being very similar. I wonder how much of it is due to extremism and maybe radicalization. Have you looked into that dimension yet?
It's a good question. I don't really have an answer. There's increasing evidence, though, I would argue, of this horseshoe theory of politics that as you move away from the center to the left and the right, they curve around and then, you know, they almost meet up at the end. I was always a little skeptical of this in the past, but the last 5 years, especially the pandemic, has provided a lot of indications that is true in many different countries. But I don't have any data or strong evidence for that up my sleeve.
Thank you.
One question here.
Thank you. I was wondering about polarization. So that's a term that's used a lot and not always defined. And I was wondering, how did you define and how did you measure polarization in your work?
Yeah, good question. There's lots of different ways in which it could be measured. We looked at co-voting patterns. This is a database run by American political scientists, and it's been, you know, it's out there, it's been around forever. And the basic idea is that if members of Congress from two opposing parties never vote with each other on anything, they're highly polarized. If they're kind of intermingling occasionally, then there's less polarization. And if you then aggregate that across all members of Congress and do some, you know, statistics, blah, 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 some algorithms, then out pops this single line that tells you on average how much a Congress is polarized. So that very specifically is the answer to your question. And then the next question is, well, is that a bad thing? Is polarization a bad thing? And that's an important question as well. I think the answer there is that it depends on the extent of polarization. If you have zero polarization, you have something called North Korea, right? There's no polarization in North Korea, I can assure you. If you have extreme polarization so that people want to kill each other, well, that's probably not so good. Somewhere in between, there's a sweet spot where there's sufficient polarization for democracy to move forward because at least people disagree. And, you know, you can try different things and maybe come up with something better. But, you know, there's a sweet spot in the middle. And what our data suggests is that in the United States, polarization arguably is beyond that sweet spot now because productivity has declined and inequality has gone up.
All right, we've reached 4 o'clock, so thank you, Steve, a lot.
Okay, thank you. I'll start recording.